The ocean wind carries a strange echo along the rocky cliffs of San Francisco, an echo that feels too vast for the bare concrete shells scattered across the shoreline. Anyone seeing these ruins for the first time notices the same unsettling contradiction. The place looks abandoned, silent, almost forgotten, yet there is an undeniable sense that something enormous once breathed here. The broken walls do not resemble the remains of a simple building. They look like ribs of a creature that should not have existed, the ghost of an engineering marvel that somehow defied both nature and common sense. Standing among these remnants, it is almost impossible to imagine that a massive glass palace once towered over this exact spot, shimmering against the Pacific horizon like a misplaced dream. The mind tries to fill the emptiness with shapes it cannot fully reconstruct: arches of steel, endless corridors of glass, the rhythmic echo of water striking tiled basins. And yet, even the boldest imagination struggles to picture what the Sutro Baths looked like in their prime. Today, only fragments remain: a few carved trenches that once held vast pools, rusted metal fixtures embedded in stone like fossils, and the damp outlines of walls that once held back millions of gallons of seawater. But the silence hides the most surprising truth of all. This place did not begin as a bathhouse. It was never supposed to become one of the largest aquatic complexes the world had ever seen. Its origin was smaller, stranger, and far more ambitious than anyone today might guess. Long before the glass roofs rose above the waves, before crowds lined the promenades and steam filled the air, this inlet was nothing more than an overlooked corner of the coastline, a shallow cove shaped by centuries of tides and storms. It was unassuming, a place where the ocean came and went without witnesses. Yet something about it captured a visionary's attention, someone capable of seeing what others could not. The transformation that would eventually define the shoreline began with a single observation. This little cove could become a gateway, not for swimmers or tourists, but for something entirely different, something no one had attempted at such a scale on the American West Coast. The early idea was almost unbelievable in its simplicity. Use the natural rhythms of the ocean to create a massive open-air aquarium, not a decorative tank in a garden, but a living reservoir where tides themselves would refresh and maintain a thriving marine world. Crabs, fish, and other creatures of the Pacific would pass through a controlled basin, studied and displayed in a way that merged science, nature, and public wonder. It was a daring concept, even eccentric, but it revealed the mind behind it, a mind not concerned with what was realistic, but with what was possible. As the vision grew, the cove began drawing the attention of locals who wondered why such an isolated, windswept piece of coastline suddenly attracted unusual activity. Surveying poles appeared, small structures were erected, and workers walked the cliffs, measuring angles and distances that seemed pointless to any ordinary observer. But nothing about this project was ordinary, because the person who initiated it never aimed for the ordinary. He aimed for transformation, of land, of architecture, and of the very idea of public spaces. Step by step, almost imperceptibly at first, the project drifted away from the idea of an aquarium. It expanded into something broader, something that would require a man with rare determination and experience, someone who already knew how to reshape landscapes and force nature into collaboration. And so, the Quiet Cove became the staging ground for an undertaking that would eventually swallow entire fortunes, challenge engineering norms, and carve its legend into the coastline. Only one person had the audacity to imagine what this place could become, and soon his name would shape the horizon as firmly as the cliffs themselves. The ruins we see today are only the final whispers of that vision, but its beginning, its true beginning, lies in the moment when a German engineer stepped onto the rocky edge of the Pacific and realized that this stretch of land was waiting for him. And that man was Adolph Sutro. The story of the man behind the future seaside wonder begins far from the crashing waves of the Pacific. Adolph Sutro arrived in America with more knowledge than money, carrying the mindset of someone who viewed obstacles not as limits, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. Long before he ever set eyes on the Quiet Cove that would later host his most audacious construction, he had already built a reputation as someone capable of reshaping the earth itself. His early career in the mountains of Nevada revealed a character defined by persistence, calculation, and an unusual willingness to confront the impossible head-on. The mining towns of the West were harsh places, filled with hope, ambition, and constant danger, and it was here that Sutro saw the flaws in the industry more clearly than others. Deep underground, miners worked in narrow shafts that flooded unpredictably and trapped heat like a sealed furnace. Fires spread silently, gases collected invisibly, and the deeper the tunnels went, the greater the risk became. What most people accepted as unavoidable dangers, Sutro saw as an engineering failure, something that could be corrected with the right idea and enough determination to pursue it despite widespread doubt. His solution was staggering in its boldness, a tunnel so long and so carefully angled that it could drain and ventilate entire mining networks at once. Even explaining the idea to investors was difficult. Few believed anyone could carve through miles of rock with such precision, and even fewer believed it was worth trying. Yet, Sutro pushed forward, convinced that a single project could change the entire mining industry. What followed was a mixture of meticulous planning, relentless advocacy, and a willingness to withstand years of skepticism. Miners worked in brutal conditions, companies hesitated, and nature resisted at every turn. But Sutro's resolve never cracked. Then came the event that changed everything. A catastrophic fire in one of the major mines forced even the most skeptical voices to acknowledge that a safer escape route might have prevented immense tragedy. Suddenly, the impossible proposal took on a different weight. Support increased, investors arrived, and the tunneling effort gained unstoppable momentum. It took years to complete, but once operational, the structure functioned exactly as Sutro had predicted. It drained the mines, cooled them, and turned deep excavation into a far more manageable undertaking. What seemed unthinkable became not just possible, but essential. The tunnel brought Sutro wealth and influence, but more importantly, it proved something to him. Earth, stone, and water could be controlled with the right combination of creativity and engineering. Boundaries that intimidated others acted as invitations to him. This was not a man who merely used technology. He wielded it to bend the environment to his will. Yet the astonishing part of the story is that all of this, the struggle, the triumph, the fame, was only preparation. It was the foundation of a mindset that would later allow him to attempt something no one had imagined on the edge of San Francisco's cliffs. The skills he gained underground would become the hidden skeleton of a structure meant not for miners, but for thousands of everyday people seeking light, warmth, and escape beside the ocean. Long before he designed the great glass pavilions or engineered the tidal systems that fed them, Sutro learned to move mountains. And that experience would soon guide him toward a new frontier where stone, steel, and water would once again follow his command, this time above ground and on a scale that would change the coastline forever. After years spent reshaping the mines of Nevada, Adolph Sutro turned his attention westward toward the restless edge of the continent where land met the Pacific. San Francisco was expanding rapidly, stretching outward from its dense urban core toward cliffs that many residents considered too rugged, too windy, too unforgiving to ever become useful. But Sutro saw the opposite. The oceanfront was not a barrier to him. It was an open canvas. The very qualities that discouraged others drew him closer. The raw cliffs, the unpredictable tides, the empty hillsides untouched by development. To most people, the coastline was a dramatic backdrop. To him, it was potential. He began acquiring land quietly, parcel by parcel, until the scale of his vision became impossible to ignore. Some locals whispered that he was buying more than any private citizen should control. Others assumed he was collecting real estate for profit or speculation. Yet the pattern of his purchases revealed something deeper. He wasn't buying prime commercial streets or fertile valleys. He was gathering the windswept perimeter of the city, the outer edge where the landscape was more dramatic than practical. It was as if he were assembling the frame of a giant, unseen structure, preparing foundations long before anyone knew what would stand upon them. The bluffs overlooking the Pacific were unlike anything in the city. The land rose high above the surf, offering breathtaking views that shifted with every hour of daylight. The salt mist that hung over the rocks carved shapes into the stone, smoothing some surfaces and sharpening others. The roar of the ocean echoed constantly across the cliffs, giving the place a sense of wildness that felt both dangerous and sacred. Sutro recognized in this environment something the city lacked, a place where ordinary people could experience beauty without needing wealth or privilege. He envisioned a sanctuary that belonged to everyone who reached it, not just those who could afford private gardens or expensive clubs. But even as he began shaping trails, planting trees, and sketching rough outlines for future structures, few understood his intentions. Some assumed he planned to create a resort for the elite, modeled after European coastal retreats. Others believed he wanted to build a private estate of extraordinary scale, a monument to his newfound status. Yet Sutro's private notes suggested an entirely different motivation. He wanted accessibility, a public realm where the natural world and human ingenuity could coexist. He believed that landscapes should uplift anyone who visited, regardless of background. In his mind, the ocean cliffs were not a trophy, but a responsibility. As workmen cleared pathways and installed early landscaping, hints of his greater vision began to emerge. Carriages started taking curious visitors up the new roads, offering glimpses of the panoramic views that would later define Sutro Heights. People who once avoided the windswept cliffs found themselves drawn to the transformed hillsides, marveling at how quickly the ruggedness softened into something inviting. But even this elaborate park was only the first stroke of a much larger plan. Sutro was preparing the land for something far more ambitious than gardens and walking paths. He was setting the stage for a structure that would harness the ocean itself, a place where engineering, recreation, and spectacle would merge into an unprecedented experience. And so, while the city speculated, he continued shaping the coastal landscape with unwavering patience. Piece by piece, the bluffs became not just property, but the groundwork for a monumental project only he could see clearly. On these cliffs, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the sea carved its own rhythms into the rocks, the future site of an enormous glass-covered complex waited silently. The transformation of the shoreline had begun, and soon the world would understand what Sutro had been building toward all along. When Sutro began shaping the windswept cliffs into something more welcoming, the transformation felt almost unreal. What had once been a rugged, wind-carved stretch of coastline slowly evolved into a landscape that looked transported from another continent. Sutro Heights emerged with terraces cut into the slopes, broad paths winding between carefully placed sculptures, and manicured gardens arranged with an intentional elegance that echoed European imperial estates. Visitors walking through the grounds often found themselves surprised by the contrast. On one side, the relentless Pacific crashed against the rocks. On the other, fountains and flower beds created a sense of calm refinement, as if nature itself had been persuaded to slow down for a moment and admire the view. Tall viewing towers rose above the treetops, allowing guests to step into the wind and look far across the city and the ocean. The towers were not just architectural flourishes, they were symbols of Sutro's desire to elevate the everyday experience. Standing at the top, one could watch fog roll in like a living wall, or see the sun fall behind the horizon in slow, brilliant layers. The gardens were filled with artwork from across the world, statues, ornamental pieces, even recreations of historic motifs. Each addition felt intentional, not as a show of wealth, but as an invitation for visitors to see beauty from multiple cultures in a single place. And the most striking part was that these grounds were open to everyone. Sutro insisted on that. He wanted the cliffs to be a place where a streetcar worker and a wealthy merchant stood side by side, both looking out at the same horizon. To many, the gardens looked like a completed dream. The scale, the detail, and the generosity behind the project suggested that Sutro Heights might be his grand legacy, a cultural retreat perched above an unruly ocean. But anyone paying close attention noticed something peculiar. Despite all the grandeur, Sutro didn't slow his pace. Workers continued surveying new sections of land. Engineers kept taking measurements, examining slopes, testing soil, and mapping the coastline with a focus far more intense than what a simple park required. The gardens felt less like an ending, and more like a prelude, the opening movement of a plan still hidden beneath layers of ambition. Directly below the cliffs, separated from the elegant walkways by steep drops and narrow trails, lay a small, unremarkable cove. It did not attract much attention, just a pool shaped by the tides, quiet and almost overlooked. While most visitors gazed outward toward the ocean or upward toward the gardens, Sutro found his eyes drifting back to this modest dip in the shoreline. To him, it wasn't insignificant at all. Its shape, its depth, the way the waves filled and retreated from it, it all suggested potential. Where others saw an idle pocket of seawater, he saw a natural foundation, a basin that could evolve into something extraordinary. That cove was the point where his imagination began to shift. All the terraces, sculptures, and lookouts above were impressive, but they were only the preparation. In Sutro's mind, the true spectacle would not be built on the cliffs, but at sea level, where the raw power of the Pacific met human ingenuity. The gardens were an invitation. The cove would become the revelation. Hidden beneath the quiet surface was the first hint of the immense structure that would eventually rise from this very spot, an engineering marvel that would draw crowds from every corner of the city. And so, while visitors admired the blossoming paths and sweeping views, Sutro stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the tide fill the cove again and again, already imagining glass arches, heated waters, and a world within a world. The illusion of paradise he created above was only the beginning. The real transformation was preparing to unfold below, in that unassuming pool of seawater, waiting for its moment to become the birthplace of a legend. The quiet cove below Sutro Heights first stirred Adolph Sutro's imagination, not with visions of crowds or grand architecture, but with something far more contained and almost scientific in nature. As he studied the way the tide moved through the inlet, how seawater surged in, settled, and slipped back out, he began to picture a living exhibit, a kind of open-air aquarium that harnessed the ocean's natural rhythms. The idea was bold, yet logical. Create a controlled basin where marine creatures could be observed, studied, and appreciated by the public. The Pacific itself would refill the pools twice a day. No artificial tanks, no isolated environments, just a dynamic, constantly renewing marine world shaped by the coastline. In Sutro's original sketches, walkways curved around the edges of the cove, allowing visitors to peer directly into saltwater channels where fish darted between rocky shelves and crabs crawled across the sand. The basin would act as both a scientific resource and a spectacle of nature. He imagined families strolling along the promenade, children marveling at the creatures beneath the water's surface, and scholars visiting to collect observations for research. This early version of the project felt intimate, educational, and deeply connected to the coast itself. It would be a unique attraction, far different from the recreational gardens above, and entirely unlike anything else in San Francisco. But Sutro's ideas rarely stayed small for long. Each refinement of the initial concept seemed to spark an entirely new direction. As he studied the cove more closely, he began seeing not just a basin for marine life, but a space where people could move comfortably, relax, and linger. The geology of the area offered natural terraces that could be integrated into broader pathways. The cliffs formed a natural amphitheater, and the constant view of the ocean gave the area an atmosphere both dramatic and peaceful. Soon the aquarium concept began to merge with something more expansive. A coastal promenade, a place to walk, observe, breathe in the ocean air, and experience the sweep of the Pacific in a way that felt safe and curated, yet still wild. He envisioned wide platforms overlooking the water, elegant railings, shaded seating areas, and glass panels that allowed visitors to watch the tide wash across the rocks without getting swept away. The project grew from a contained scientific feature into a multi-level coastal retreat. For a moment, this seemed like the natural endpoint, an accessible extension of Sutro Heights, a sort of lower garden sculpted by the sea. But as preparations began and notes piled up, a subtle shift occurred. The question that now pulled at Sutro's thoughts was not, how can people observe the ocean, but rather, how can people experience it directly? That shift changed everything. He began imagining not an aquarium or promenade, but a place where thousands could gather in comfort, shielded from the harsh winds yet still surrounded by seawater. He pictured enormous reservoirs capable of filling with millions of gallons, harnessing the tides not just to feed a basin, but to refresh entire pools. The natural cove could serve as a foundation, but the structure built around it would have to be something monumental, something that fused engineering and recreation into one seamless environment. Sutro realized that if he could apply the same ingenuity he had once used underground in Nevada, nothing prevented him from creating the largest indoor bathing complex the world had ever seen. The idea matured quickly. Visitors wouldn't simply stand near the water. They would swim in it. Families could spend hours in warm, sheltered pools. Athletes could train in vast saltwater basins. Even the storms that battered the cliffs would only enhance the spectacle, their force contained behind massive glass walls that kept guests protected while letting them witness the Pacific's power. And because accessibility had always been central to Sutro's philosophy, the baths would be priced low enough for ordinary workers to enjoy, enormous luxury without the exclusivity that usually accompanied such spaces. With this evolution complete, the aquarium disappeared from his plans. The promenade became only an entryway. The hotel concept was set aside entirely. What remained was a vision so ambitious that even those closest to Sutro struggled to grasp it. A cathedral of water, glass, steel, and sunlight. An engineering wonder built at the edge of the continent. And so, the modest cove that once held nothing more than pooled seawater became the birthplace of an idea that dwarfed everything Sutro had built before. The sketches solidified, the calculations began, and the workers prepared to reshape the coastline once again. The quiet days of planning were ending. Ahead lay a construction project unlike anything San Francisco or America had ever attempted. Turning an isolated cove into the world's most ambitious bathing complex required far more than imagination. It demanded an entire hidden infrastructure, networks of tunnels, pumps, and structural supports that had to perform flawlessly against the most unforgiving force on the West Coast, the Pacific Ocean. As soon as the first plans were finalized, Sutro gathered engineers, surveyors, and craftsmen who understood that this project was not just a building, but a machine, one that needed to function with the precision of a living organism. The cliffs had to be carved and reinforced. The ocean's behavior had to be studied in meticulous detail, and every piece of the landscape had to be persuaded into cooperation. Beneath the ground, far from the eyes of future visitors, crews began excavating a labyrinth of tunnels carved directly into the rock. These passageways were the arteries of the baths, guiding seawater from the open ocean into the massive reservoirs that would eventually feed the pools. Some tunnels carried water at high tide through natural inlets, while others were built to house powerful pumping systems, capable of pulling thousands of gallons per minute when the tide dropped too low. These pumps were not decorative additions. They were essential to keeping the pools filled, filtered, and refreshed without ever relying on stagnant water. They turned the raw force of the Pacific into a regulated, controlled supply that flowed through the baths with rhythmic consistency. Above ground, workers erected foundations that defied the harsh coastal environment. The structure had to resist constant salt exposure, heavy winds, earthquakes, and the steady erosion of the cliffs themselves. Steel frames were anchored into bedrock, creating a skeletal backbone capable of supporting immense weight. Over this framework, vast arches of glass were mounted, panels designed to capture sunlight even on foggy days, warming the interior without relying entirely on artificial heating. The roof became a monumental achievement. A shimmering canopy that enclosed acres of water, turning an exposed coastline into a sheltered indoor world while still allowing visitors to see the ocean's shifting moods just beyond the glass. Inside, the engineering complexity only increased. Pool basins were constructed with reinforced materials to withstand constant changes in temperature and water pressure. Channels were carved to guide seawater into each pool, where boilers and furnaces adjusted temperatures to create varied bathing environments. Some pools remained cool and natural, drawing directly from the ocean with minimal intervention, while others were warmed, filtered, and circulated to create a more controlled experience. The entire system resembled a giant hydraulic organism, each part working in coordination with the others to maintain millions of gallons of water in a state of constant motion. Lighting and ventilation required solutions just as innovative. Massive windowed walls and glass ceilings allowed natural light to fill the interior, reflecting off the water to create an atmosphere that felt open and vibrant even during gloomy weather. Ventilation shafts were strategically integrated into the arches and tunnels to prevent humidity from accumulating and damaging the structure. The design ensured that warm air rose and escaped while cooler sea breezes circulated through the building. Every detail, from drainage angles to walkway elevations, had to be calibrated with a level of precision normally reserved for industrial facilities, not recreational spaces. As the final structural elements came together, the baths began to resemble a colossal greenhouse fused with a cathedral of steel. Workers could finally stand inside and look upward to see the curved glass overhead, shimmering with sunlight that danced across the unfinished pools. The mechanical systems beneath the floor hummed quietly as they were tested, sending controlled bursts of seawater through the channels and tunnels. What had once been an empty cove now housed a complex capable of cycling millions of gallons of ocean water with an efficiency far ahead of its time. With the infrastructure nearly complete, the structure stood ready for its next transformation. The bones of the marvel had been set in glass and steel. The arteries of water were prepared to flow, and the immense silent chambers waited only for movement. Now, the question was no longer how to build such a place, but how to breathe life into it. How to turn this immense machine into a vibrant world filled with people, sound, and energy. Stepping inside the completed structure felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The ocean winds that battered the cliffs outside faded instantly, replaced by a warm, echoing atmosphere filled with movement, light, and an almost theatrical sense of scale. Overhead, the enormous glass arches curved so high that they seemed to dissolve into the bright haze above, capturing every glimmer of sunlight and scattering it across the interior like shifting curtains of gold. The ceiling alone made visitors stop in silence. It looked less like a man-made roof and more like the sky had been carefully framed and suspended above the pools. Beneath this vast canopy stretched a network of galleries and walkways that wrapped around the building like intricate balconies in a palace. These elevated paths allowed people to move above the water, offering a clear view of the pools below, as well as the churning Pacific visible through the glass walls. The soundscape inside the baths was unmistakable, echoes layered upon echoes. Water splashed rhythmically against tiled edges, footsteps resonated on metal platforms, and voices drifted through the air in soft waves, blending with the distant thrum of machines driving the tidal systems beneath the floor. 7 pools dominated the central space, each with its own identity and design. Some were long and rectangular, meant for serious swimmers and athletes. Others were curved, spacious, and inviting, glowing with filtered seawater, warm to different temperatures. The saltwater pools held the ocean's natural scent, softened and reshaped by the controlled environment. Meanwhile, the lone freshwater pool sparkled like a rare gem among its larger companions, attracting those who wanted a gentler, more tranquil experience. Together, they formed a mosaic of shimmering surfaces, constantly shifting as sunlight refracted through glass and water. Staircases spiraled between levels, some built of polished wood, others of iron that resonated with a faint metallic hum whenever crowds ascended or descended. Walkways branched into viewing decks, rest areas, and corridors that led to hidden corners of the building. Everywhere you turned, there was something alive, water moving, light bending, people gliding across the space with towels, bathing suits, or wide-eyed curiosity. The baths were more than a recreational facility. They were a carefully choreographed environment where architecture and motion blended into a living spectacle. Even the air carried its own presence. Warm drafts from the boiler rooms mingled with the coolness rising from the pools, creating gentle currents that drifted around the towering pillars. Fog from the ocean occasionally pressed against the glass, dimming the light before retreating and revealing the full brilliance of the interior once more. The contrast between the controlled climate inside and the wild coastline outside added a layer of tension. The building felt like a fragile jewel set against the immense forces of nature, protected yet constantly aware of the world just beyond its walls. And yet, for all the visual splendor, the water itself was not the most astonishing feature. What truly stunned visitors was the scale of the environment, the feeling of being enveloped by a self-contained universe that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The baths did more than hold pools. They created an atmosphere where engineering, architecture, and human energy merged seamlessly into a single breathtaking experience. The real marvel was not the 7 shimmering basins, but the sensation of standing inside a glass-walled realm that felt alive, purposeful, and unlike anything else on the coast. The pools were remarkable, but they were only the beginning. The most extraordinary surprise waited just beyond the splash and shine of the water, an entire world of discoveries woven into the galleries and corridors, ready to reveal itself as visitors explored deeper into this vast and shimmering sanctuary. Beyond the pools and glass arches, deeper inside the great structure, the baths revealed a second identity, one that transformed the building from a simple recreational escape into a cultural experience unlike anything else in the city. While visitors came expecting water, what many did not anticipate was the immense museum that stretched across the upper galleries and along the promenade. Here, suspended above the steam rising from the pools, stood an eclectic collection of artifacts gathered from around the world, forming a surreal contrast between ancient history and the modern marvel of engineering below. As guests climbed the staircases and stepped onto the wide gallery paths, they found themselves surrounded by objects that belonged more to the halls of European museums than a seaside bathhouse. Cases held mineral specimens glimmering with crystalline color, fossils etched with the memories of prehistoric eras, and taxidermied animals posed in lifelike scenes that seemed ready to spring back into motion. Every turn offered a new curiosity. Preserved birds with jeweled plumage, intricately carved wooden pieces from distant cultures, and rare geological finds collected from regions most visitors would never see firsthand. Yet nothing drew more fascination than the Egyptian artifacts. Mummies, sarcophagi, and fragments of ancient craftsmanship stood only a few steps from the balcony rails overlooking the warm, shimmering pools. The mixture of warm steam, filtered sunlight, and the quiet hum of voices gave the displays an almost dreamlike quality. The contrast was unreal, thousands of years of history suspended above an environment filled with the splashing of swimmers, the glint of seawater, and the scent of salt in the air. It felt as though time itself had been folded, bringing together pieces of distant civilizations and placing them inside a modern cathedral of glass and steel. The museum did more than surprise. It encouraged exploration. Families wandered through the galleries between swims, pausing to study ancient carvings or peer at exotic taxidermy animals preserved in elaborate scenes. Scholars and travelers found themselves immersed in a collection that blended natural wonders with artistic treasures. Children pointed excitedly at strange artifacts they had never imagined could exist in the same building where they had just splashed through salt water warmed by boilers beneath their feet. The fusion of leisure and learning turned every visit into a layered experience, half recreation, half education. But the museum's presence was not simply an indulgence or a decorative flourish. Sutro designed it with purpose. He understood that not every resident of the city could travel to far-off places or afford private collections. Yet everyone deserved the chance to encounter the extraordinary. By placing a world's worth of curiosities inside a public space, he offered a cultural gateway for people of all backgrounds. It was a way to elevate the experience of ordinary citizens, giving them access to knowledge and beauty typically reserved for the privileged. And that philosophy extended beyond the museum walls. The building itself, beneath all its splendor, carried a deeper mission. It was never just a palace of glass, never just a gathering place for swimmers or tourists. It was meant to serve the entire community, to provide an escape from the pressures of city life, to offer both entertainment and enrichment. The structure had to justify its existence not by luxury alone, but by the value it added to society. Soon, the need to meet that mission would become more challenging than anyone expected. The baths were magnificent, but their survival depended on more than beauty and ambition. It required constant upkeep, innovative management, and a steady flow of visitors from every corner of the growing city, a balance that would soon prove far more fragile than the soaring glass arches suggested. From the moment the doors opened, the baths operated as a machine built not for the privileged few, but for the multitudes. Everything about the structure, its scale, its layout, its pricing, was designed to welcome crowds rather than limit them. Unlike exclusive clubs or private seaside retreats, this giant glass complex invited the city's workers, families, and visitors to step inside and escape the noise of daily life. The cost of admission was low enough for ordinary people to afford without hesitation, and this accessibility became one of the defining features of the entire enterprise. It wasn't just a grand attraction, it was a kind of social equalizer where anyone could wander through galleries of artifacts, glide down into warm saltwater, or stand beneath the sweeping skylights that refracted sunlight into shifting patterns across the floor. Transportation played a crucial role in sustaining such a vision. Sutro understood that even the most marvelous place was meaningless if people couldn't reach it easily, so he created an elegant system that carried visitors directly from the heart of the city to the ocean's edge. Streetcars and trams ran at regular intervals, climbing the hills and winding through developing neighborhoods until they stopped steps away from the entrance. The ride itself became a small event, a gentle ascent toward the cliffs followed by the breathtaking view of the Pacific appearing suddenly at the end of the line. For many patrons, the journey was a part of the ritual, a transition from the crowded streets to the open horizon and the shimmering structure awaiting them. Inside, the baths operated with astonishing efficiency. Wide corridors allowed smooth movement even during peak hours. Dressing rooms lined with rows of lockers accommodated vast numbers of guests, while staircases and elevated walkways prevented bottlenecks around the pools. The building could hold thousands at a time, entire crowds walking through its galleries, filling its amphitheater, splashing in its saltwater pools, or relaxing on balconies that overlooked the rocky coastline. On holidays or warm afternoons, the interior vibrated with life. The laughter of children echoed against the metal beams. Swimmers raced across the water under the glow of sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling, and families explored the museum in between their moments of leisure. This seamless blend of beauty and accessibility made the baths an essential destination for the city. Newspapers described them as a marvel of public entertainment, and visitors spoke of the baths as a place where the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary dissolved. For a modest fee, a person could experience a world usually reserved for those with far more wealth: galleries of global artifacts, expansive heated pools, architectural splendor, and views that rivaled any resort. It was a place where luxury did not exclude, it embraced. Yet within all this generosity lay the seeds of the first major challenge. The very features that made the baths extraordinary, the enormous pools, the constant flow of filtered seawater, the glowing glass roofs, and the endless maintenance required to keep the machinery running, demanded resources far beyond those of typical public facilities. Heating vast quantities of water, preserving metal frames against constant exposure to salt air, repairing glass damaged by winds, and operating the pumps below the floors, all of these tasks carried immense costs. The building was not just a pleasure palace. It was an enormous, complex organism that required continuous care. And while the crowds kept coming, the financial weight of sustaining such a marvel began to press heavily on those responsible for its operation. The baths were a gift to the people of the city, but every gift came with a price. Soon, the contrast between public joy and private burden would shift the balance, revealing cracks not in the structure itself, but in the delicate system that kept it alive. The grand vision had succeeded in every way except the one that mattered most for its survival. The challenge of maintaining a wonder built at such extraordinary scale was only beginning to show itself. After the passing of Adolph Sutro, the great glass complex stood unchanged in appearance, but something essential in its foundation shifted. The guiding force that had held every piece of the project together, his vision, his ambition, his relentless conviction, was suddenly gone. The baths remained open, the pools were still warm, the museum still glowed under the arches of sunlight. But without Sutro's presence, the building felt as if it had lost its anchor. What had once been a tightly coordinated machine now had to rely on successors who admired the creation but could not replicate the mind that built it. The challenges that Sutro had managed through sheer willpower began to surface more clearly. Maintaining the enormous structure required constant attention and significant investment. The pumps needed regular repairs, the boilers demanded fuel, and the glass panels were in perpetual battle with the ocean winds, which carried salt that corroded metal and clouded the panes. Every month revealed another costly necessity: replacing weakened beams, reinforcing railings, patching damaged tiles, sealing leaks in the reservoirs, or addressing erosion at the base of the cliffs. Under Sutro, these issues had been tackled with determination and personal oversight. Without him, they accumulated faster than management could address them. Meanwhile, the city around the baths was changing. Entertainment trends evolved, new attractions appeared across San Francisco, and the public's expectations shifted with modernization. Some visitors who once came weekly found themselves drawn to cinemas, amusement parks, or other urban diversions that required fewer resources to maintain and were easier to reach. Transportation broadened the city's options, offering residents more choices for leisure than ever before. As a result, the crowds that once packed the baths began to thin, not significantly at first, but enough for the operators to notice the subtle decline in revenue. Despite these difficulties, the building did not collapse into jeopardy overnight. It still held power over those who visited, still glimmered when the sun caught its glass roof, still offered the familiar scent of saltwater and the comforting warmth rising from its heated pools. Families continued bringing their children, athletes still trained in the expansive basins, and tourists still wandered through the museum's eclectic displays. The baths retained their charm, and for a time, it seemed as though the structure might find a way to survive this new era through tradition and nostalgia alone. But beneath the steady hum of daily life, the financial strain grew heavier. Repairs demanded increasing sums, and the revenue no longer rose to meet them. The owners attempted to adjust prices and introduce new events to bring people back, but nothing could fully counteract the mounting operational costs. The baths were vast, magnificent, and inspiring, but they were also fragile, reliant on flawless coordination and constant funding. The first cracks in the glass were not literal. They were a quiet shift in balance, a sign that the future of the complex was no longer secure. The building was still standing, still radiant, still functioning as a sanctuary for thousands, but the foundation beneath its continued operation had begun to tremble. It held on with stubborn resilience, but the era of effortless prosperity was slipping away, leaving the baths to fight against forces that even Sutro himself might have struggled to overcome. For now, the structure endured, carried forward by memory, admiration, and hope. But change was moving steadily toward the glass palace by the ocean, and the struggle to preserve it had only just begun. As the years moved further away from the era of Adolph Sutro's leadership, the responsibility of preserving the enormous seaside complex fell to those who admired it, but lacked his singular vision and financial resolve. The baths no longer operated with the effortless momentum of their early decades. Every season brought new maintenance challenges and rising costs, forcing the caretakers to think creatively, not about expanding the structure, as Sutro once had, but about reinventing it in ways that might attract new visitors and restore its place in the city's cultural landscape. What followed was a long period of experimentation, transformation, and increasingly urgent attempts to keep the giant afloat. The first changes were gentle adjustments, fresh coats of paint, polished metal fixtures, new seating areas overlooking the pools, but it soon became clear that simple upkeep was no longer enough. The baths needed reinvention to compete with a rapidly evolving entertainment world. So, the managers introduced thematic redesigns, embellishing the interior with vivid decorations, tropical motifs, and modernized spaces that contrasted sharply with the building's original classical elegance. Palm fronds, vibrant murals, and colored lighting appeared around the pools, giving the once refined atmosphere a livelier, almost theatrical character, meant to appeal to families and younger visitors. Events became another lifeline. On weekends, the baths transformed into a stage for a rotating cast of performers, acrobats, synchronized swimmers, magicians, musicians, and novelty acts designed to fill the cavernous space with excitement. One of the more memorable features was a diving dog, whose performances drew crowds eager for spectacle rather than quiet recreation. Championship swim meets were hosted in the larger basins, generating brief surges in attendance and press attention. These efforts brought moments of renewed energy, turning the baths into a venue where the line between amusement park and grand architectural landmark blurred. For a time, the experiments worked. Visitors returned, families filled the galleries, and the great glass palace once again echoed with laughter and applause. Yet behind the scenes, the financial pressure grew tighter. Each new attraction required investment: sets, lighting, performers, additional staff. Every renovation introduced new costs while doing little to reduce the enormous baseline expenses of running the complex. Filters needed replacing, boilers needed fuel, pumps demanded constant repairs, and the Pacific Ocean remained an unrelenting adversary. Salt corroded metal more quickly than before, and storms battered the exterior with a force that pushed the building's aging infrastructure beyond what it was designed to withstand. Even during the most successful events, the revenue rarely exceeded the cost of maintenance, creating a slow but steady financial erosion that management struggled to reverse. Recognizing that the baths needed a dramatic transformation, the owners attempted larger-scale renovations. Some pools were drained and repurposed entirely, converted into areas for new activities such as dancing, indoor sports, and ice skating. The idea was bold. If the baths could no longer rely solely on their original purpose, they would evolve into a multifunctional entertainment complex capable of attracting a wider audience. Indoor beaches were created with sand trucked in from nearby shores, bringing a touch of coastal leisure into the shelter of the glass roof. Ping-pong tables lined the walkways. Temporary stages were built for performances. The building became a collage of experiences, part museum, part sports arena, part theater, but still carrying the echo of its former grandeur beneath layers of improvisation. For a while, these innovations gave the structure a new pulse. Advertisements touted its variety, promising something for every kind of visitor. But the underlying reality remained unchanged. The baths were simply too large, too complex, too dependent on expensive systems that never took a day off. The pumps kept running, whether 2,000 people filled the pools or only 20. The boilers needed fuel even when the weather was mild. The upkeep of the glass ceiling, the steel beams, the flooding channels, all demanded funding that the attendance numbers could no longer support consistently. Slowly, the ledger began to reveal the truth long disguised by creative programming and bursts of excitement. The baths were slipping deeper into financial distress. No matter how many shows were held or how many themes were introduced, the scale of the building consumed resources at a rate that ticket sales, concessions, and events could never match. The owners, despite their efforts, found themselves caught between admiration for the structure and the inescapable weight of its operating costs. The giant was still standing, still magnificent in its own aging way, but it had become clear that the struggle to preserve it was turning into a losing battle. The more they fought to keep the baths alive, the more the financial pressure tightened, hinting at challenges ahead that no amount of creativity or reinvention could fully overcome. The moment was approaching when the limits of preservation would collide with the reality of mounting debt, and the building's fate would begin to shift toward its final, irreversible chapter. In the final era of the Great Complex, its transformation into an ice skating arena marked both an act of ingenuity and a quiet acknowledgement that the baths had moved far beyond their original identity. By the mid-20th century, the Oceanside Palace no longer drew the vast crowds that once packed its galleries. Swimming had lost its novelty. Families sought entertainment in new districts of the city, and the financial strain of maintaining the massive pools had become unsustainable. The decision to convert the interior into a full-scale rink was born out of necessity, a bold attempt to give the structure a new pulse at a time when its heartbeat was growing faint. The renovation was sweeping. Workers drained the pools that had defined the space for generations, exposing the tile work that had once gleamed beneath warm saltwater. Mechanical systems originally designed to cycle millions of gallons of ocean water were either shut down or reconfigured. In their place came refrigeration units, compressors, and insulated platforms capable of sustaining sheets of ice across vast surfaces. The interior was reshaped to create rinks large enough to host competitions, public skating sessions, and winter-themed events. The galleries overlooking the pools remained in place, but now spectators leaned against the railings to watch skaters glide in wide arcs beneath the towering glass arches. For a brief moment, it felt as if the baths had discovered a second youth. Children clung to the sides of the rink, laughing as they tried to balance on thin blades. Couples wove slow circles hand in hand. Music drifted upward and echoed across the ceiling, filling the space with a fresh, festive energy that seemed to push back the weariness settling into the building's bones. On weekends, the rink glowed under bulbs strung across the interior, creating a warm, nostalgic atmosphere that contrasted with the cold surface of the ice. The transformation brought a sense of novelty that the facility desperately needed, and for a time, visitors returned with renewed enthusiasm. Yet, beneath the joyful scenes, the structure continued to deteriorate. The relentless ocean air, heavy with salt and moisture, seeped into every exposed seam. Metal beams that once supported the expansive glass roof showed signs of corrosion deeper than earlier repairs could hide. Glass panels vibrated in strong coastal winds, occasionally cracking and forcing teams to erect temporary scaffolding for emergency replacements. The walls, stressed by decades of temperature fluctuations and constant humidity, developed subtle shifts that caused joints to weaken and supports to sag. Even the rink's machinery proved costly to maintain, adding new financial burdens even as it extended the life of the building. Storm seasons became especially challenging. Heavy winter winds battered the glass roof, testing the limits of the aging structure. Rainwater worked its way into hidden channels where insulation had worn thin, causing leaks that dripped across the arena floor or pooled in corners of the building. Some nights required staff to mop continuously so that early morning skaters could use the rink without risk of slipping on water instead of ice. Engineers warned that the complex was decaying faster than it could be restored, and each new inspection revealed additional areas requiring urgent attention. The building, magnificent in its early years, had reached an age when even the simplest repairs required extensive resources. Attendance, though boosted by the rink, was no longer enough to offset the rising cost of maintaining such a vast and time-worn structure. While the public still held affection for the baths, nostalgia could not generate the funds needed to keep the enormous glass palace safe, functional, and structurally sound. Cracks in the concrete foundations grew more pronounced. Machinery that once pumped ocean water or sustained sheets of ice needed replacement instead of repair. The rink lights flickered more often. Entire sections of the building were closed temporarily to address safety concerns that multiplied year by year. And then, just as managers grappled with the mounting expenses and the impossible task of repairing everything that demanded attention, a new factor emerged, one that would reshape the building's destiny more dramatically than any financial challenge or structural failure. Developers saw opportunity in the land beneath the aging edifice, envisioning a future that did not include a crumbling palace of glass, but instead modern construction better suited to the changing times. Their interest introduced a shift that would soon determine the bath's fate, setting into motion a chain of events that would push the iconic complex toward its final, irreversible transformation. In the mid-1960s, as the once majestic complex struggled against time, weather, and mounting financial pressure, the conversation among its owners and the city began to shift from restoration to replacement. Developers had drawn up plans for modern housing and commercial spaces that would rise where the glass palace stood. To them, the baths were no longer a symbol of innovation or public joy. They were a liability, a costly relic occupying valuable oceanfront property. Permits were discussed, deadlines whispered, and the possibility of complete demolition hovered over the site like a shadow. Yet even in its weakened state, the massive structure seemed unwilling to surrender quietly. It clung to the coastline with an eerie dignity, its steel ribs and glass crown still reflecting the changing light of the Pacific, as if refusing to accept the fate looming before it. Then came June 26, 1966, a date that would seal the building's destiny and ignite more questions than answers. It began as an ordinary evening, calm enough that the familiar roar of the ocean sounded lighter than usual against the cliffs. Workers were preparing for another day of clearing out sections of the structure in advance of redevelopment, removing wood, equipment, and anything salvageable. As twilight settled over the coastline, a faint glow appeared within the building, so small at first that it could have been dismissed as a reflection or a stray lamp left burning. But within minutes, the glow pulsed brighter, spreading with an unnerving speed that suggested something far more dangerous was unfolding inside the aging frame. Flames erupted through the lower levels before anyone had time to react. The fire moved as though it had been waiting for the opportunity, racing through wooden walkways, climbing the old supports beneath the galleries, and leaping across the airy interior with horrifying efficiency. The building's vast open spaces fed the blaze, turning each archway into a wind tunnel that pumped oxygen directly into the rising columns of heat. Thick, dark smoke spiraled upward, clouding the glass ceiling until the light of the flames became the only illumination inside the enormous structure. From the outside, the baths resembled a lantern set ablaze from within, glowing fiercely against the darkening sky. The fire engines arrived, but the firefighters faced a nearly impossible task. The building was colossal, its internal layout complex, and the flames had already consumed the walkways and staircases that once allowed access to the deeper corridors. Heat radiated outward so intensely that no one could approach the structure for long without being forced back. Glass panels in the ceiling began to crack and then burst with sharp, echoing reports, sending shards raining into the inferno below. With each collapse of metal or explosion of glass, the crowd gathering on the cliffs above felt the terrifying weight of history disappearing in real time. The baths, once a sanctuary of water and light, had become an immense, uncontrolled furnace. And then came the theories, whispers that grew quickly into pointed speculation. Some believed the fire was an accident caused by the dismantling process, a spark from equipment or a mishandled tool igniting dry timber left vulnerable by decades of wear. Others suggested a more calculated explanation. The aging structure had become a costly burden, and the insurance payout offered a convenient solution to the developer's financial dilemma. The pace at which the fire traveled, the location where it ignited, and the timing of redevelopment plans fueled suspicions that the blaze was not entirely spontaneous. Nothing was ever proven, but the murmurs persisted for years, becoming part of the bath's final haunting narrative. By the time morning arrived, the great palace by the sea had collapsed into a scorched, skeletal ruin. The pools, once filled with shimmering seawater, were buried beneath twisted metal and smoldering debris. Massive beams lay contorted across the foundations, and the museum's artifacts, those strange and beautiful treasures from around the world, were lost to smoke and heat. The building that had welcomed millions was reduced to a blackened outline against the cliffs. The air smelled of charred wood and salt, an unsettling mixture that lingered long after the flames had faded. For many, the fire felt like the final blow, the moment when the long battle to preserve the baths ended in undeniable defeat. Yet the destruction did not erase the place. It merely changed its form. Even in ruin, the site retained a peculiar magnetism. People continued to climb the cliffs and look down at the broken foundations, drawn not by the grandeur that once stood there, but by the powerful sense of memory imprinted on the stones. The building was gone, but something deeper had survived, the echo of its presence, the story of its creation, and the mystery of its end. And as the smoke cleared and the ashes cooled, a new chapter began to unfold, one that would shape the identity of the ruins for generations to come. When the last flames burned out and the smoke lifted from the coastline, what remained of the baths no longer resembled a building at all. The elegant arches, the glowing glass ceilings, the echoing galleries filled with artifacts, everything had vanished into ash and twisted metal. But as the years passed, the ruins began to settle into a new identity, one shaped not by grandeur, but by the stark honesty of what the ocean and time had left behind. Visitors who wandered down the narrow trails toward the shoreline did not encounter a forgotten wreck. Instead, they found a landscape that seemed to speak, quietly, insistently, through every fractured surface. The old pools now appeared as enormous concrete cavities carved into the earth, their outlines softened by decades of erosion. Rainwater collected in the deeper basins, creating still, reflective surfaces that mirrored the changing sky. In some corners, the sea found its way in through cracks and channels, filling the holes with brackish water that rose and fell with the tide. These flooded pockets glimmered with the remnants of what had once been meticulously heated and filtered saltwater pools, now transformed into raw, tidal forms shaped entirely by nature's hand. Broken staircases clung to the walls like fragments of a spine, leading to platforms that no longer existed. Their steps were worn by time, smoothed by countless visitors who explored the ruins after the fire, running their hands along the rusted railings and imagining the footsteps that once echoed there. Portions of the foundation jutted out of the surf like the edges of a long-lost fortress, their surfaces mottled with algae, salt, and the steady abrasion of waves. Every piece of exposed concrete, every rebar rib peeking through the walls, carried layers of history etched into its surface. Over time, the ruins became more than remnants. They became witnesses. They held the memory of the bath's rise and fall, but they also began absorbing the stories of those who visited afterward. Photographers arrived in search of dramatic landscapes. Locals came to sit quietly above the pools, watching sea foam drift into the cavities as though the ocean were reclaiming its territory. Hikers paused to feel the weight of the wind rushing through the concrete corridors. Couples traced the outlines of the former galleries, imagining the enormous structure that once stood above their heads. Even children climbed across the ruins, unaware that their laughter echoed over the same ground where thousands once swam under a shimmering roof. As word spread, the site's cultural significance deepened. The National Park Service recognized that the ruins were not merely debris, but a historical landmark that deserved protection. In 1980, the area became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, ensuring that what remained of Sutro's vision would not be erased by future development. Trails were improved, interpretive signs were added, and the story of the baths became woven into the broader narrative of San Francisco's coastline. By preserving the ruins instead of clearing them, the park allowed visitors to confront the past directly, not through reconstructions or polished displays, but through the raw, unfiltered remains of a dream that had soared and collapsed. This decision transformed the site into a kind of open-air museum, one defined not by artifacts locked behind glass, but by the textures of reality, cracked stone, rusting metal, shifting pools of seawater, and the constant breath of the Pacific wind. The ruins invited speculation, curiosity, imagination. They stood as a reminder that even the most ambitious human creations are temporary, yet their impact can resonate long after the structures themselves are gone. The absence of walls and ceilings revealed a deeper truth. Sometimes a story is most powerful when told through what remains rather than what survives intact. As visitors walked through the ruins, many found themselves reflecting not on what the baths once looked like, but on what they represented: innovation, accessibility, community, and the fragile balance between human aspiration and nature's persistent force. The building had vanished, but its essence lingered in the way people responded to the ruins. The empty foundations mirrored the memory of a place that once brought together crowds of every background. The broken staircases recalled the movement of generations. The quiet pools reflected a world that continues long after human endeavors fade away. The baths no longer existed as a functioning structure, yet in their ruined state they achieved a different kind of permanence. They became a symbol of beauty lost and preserved, of history reclaimed by the earth, and of dreams that outlived their physical form. And as the wind moved through the open spaces where ceilings once soared, the ruins seemed to whisper that a place does not vanish simply because its walls fall. Sometimes disappearance is only the beginning of a new kind of presence. Though the glass vaults have vanished and the great pools no longer ripple with the movement of swimmers, the story of the Sutro Baths has never stopped expanding. In many ways, the building's disappearance allowed its legacy to grow even larger than the structure itself. What once stood as a physical marvel of engineering and imagination now exists as something more elusive but far more enduring, a symbol shaped by memory, mystery, and the echo of a dream too ambitious to survive in its original form. The baths died as a building, but they became immortal as an idea. Standing at the edge of the ruins today, it becomes clear that the bath's enduring presence is not tied to the glass arches or the grand machinery that once pumped millions of gallons of water into shimmering basins. Instead, the power of the site lies in the contrast between what remains and what once existed. The foundations, scattered staircases, and fragmented walls serve as outlines of a larger story, giving visitors space to fill the gaps with imagination. The absence of the structure makes the legend stronger, inviting those who walk the cliffs to wonder how such a colossal creation came to be, and how it could let go so spectacularly. The memory of the baths continues because they embodied something rare in their time, a belief that beauty and leisure should belong to everyone, not only to those who could afford exclusivity. Sutro's vision was not about personal wealth or elite luxury. It was a commitment to public wonder. The baths represented a kind of generosity that rarely finds expression in monumental architecture. They offered working families a chance to experience the extraordinary, to step into a world of warm water, gleaming glass, global curiosities, and sweeping ocean views without the burden of high cost or social barriers. That spirit, even more than the physical structure, is what keeps the story alive. As decades passed and San Francisco transformed, the baths took on a second life as a cultural memory woven into the fabric of the city's identity. Artists sketched the ruins. Photographers captured their silhouettes against sunsets and storms. Writers described the echoes of voices, imagining the sounds of thousands of swimmers mingling with the crash of waves. Generations of locales grew up exploring the pools at low tide, running along the edges where once crowds had gathered, feeling an inexplicable connection to a history they had never personally witnessed. The ruins became a place where the city's past and present touched each other through the physical remnants of a dream. The lessons the baths leave behind are more potent than any preserved structure could provide. They remind us of the impermanence of ambition, the vulnerability of human creation, and the way time reshapes the meaning of even the grandest achievements. The baths stood as a testament to engineering brilliance, but they also serve as a reminder that greatness often comes with fragility. Their collapse and eventual destruction draw attention not to failure, but to the natural cycle of creation and decline, a cycle that transforms structures into stories and stories into legend. Today, when visitors stand before the pools carved into the rocks, they are encountering more than remnants of a bygone building. They are meeting the distilled essence of everything the baths represented: ambition, generosity, innovation, community, and the relentless passage of time. Each cracked pillar and flooded basin speaks louder than an intact structure ever could. The ruins encourage reflection, inviting people to imagine the ocean-scented air beneath the glass roof, the echo of laughter inside the galleries, and the glow of sunlight that once swept across the water. The Sutro Baths may have vanished from the world of functioning architecture, but they gained a kind of immortality in the process. Their legacy endures not because the building survived, but because the spirit behind it refuses to fade. The ruins, shaped by wind and tide, whisper the same truth to everyone who visits. Some places continue to live even after they are gone, and in their silence, they speak the loudest.